Load it up! Go!
September 12, 1942. Charters. Towers Airfield, Queensland. A 43-year-old man crouches beneath a bomber's nose blowtorch in hand, welding stolen machine guns, where safety regulations say they'll never fit. His hands shake, not from fear, but rage. 1,700 miles north, his wife and 4 children starve behind barbed wire in Santo Tomas prison camp, Manila. The brass called him reckless. Engineers called him insane. But Paul "Pappy" Gunn didn't care about rules anymore. He cared about firepower. And in 6 hours, he'd proved that fury properly weaponized could win wars. The smell of aviation fuel and tropical heat hung thick over Nielsen Field, Manila, on the morning of December 6, 1941. Pappy Gunn stood on the tarmac, clipboard in hand, watching mechanics service a Beechcraft Model 18, one of 12 aircraft under his command as Chief Technical Officer for Philippine Airlines. At 42, he'd already lived 3 lifetimes Navy pilot in the Great War, barnstormer across Depression-era America, and now aviation executive in the fastest-growing corner of the Pacific. He was a big man 6 feet tall with hands scarred from decades of wrench work, the kind of hands that could strip an engine blindfolded. Born in Quitman, Arkansas in 1899, he was the son of a blacksmith, a detail that mattered more than anyone knew. While other aviation executives wore suits and attended board meetings, Gunn wore grease-stained coveralls and preferred the hangar floor. His mechanics loved him. His superiors tolerated him. His family adored him. Clara, his wife of 20 years, ran their household in Manila, with the same precision Pappy applied to aircraft maintenance. Their 4 children, Paul Jr., Julie, Nathaniel, and Connie, attended American schools, swam in the Pasig River on weekends, and knew nothing of the gathering storm. The Philippines in late 1941 felt like paradise, with a salary, warm nights, cheap labor, American infrastructure overlaid on Spanish colonial architecture. For a kid from Arkansas who'd once slept in airplane hangars between barnstorming gigs, Manila represented arrival success legitimacy. But Pappy Gunn wasn't built for comfort. Even in peacetime, he obsessed over inefficiency. Why did the Beechcraft's fuel flow rate fluctuate at altitude? Could he modify the hydraulic systems to reduce maintenance intervals? His notebooks filled with sketches, not daydreams but engineering solutions to problems nobody else noticed. His boss at PAL once joked, "Gunn, you'd redesign God's blueprint if you thought it had a design flaw." Pappy just grinned. "Only if it kept my planes in the air." That philosophy, keeping planes flying at any cost, would soon become doctrine. On December 7, 1941, at 2:30 a.m., Manila time, the world exploded. Radio broadcasts crackled with impossible news. Pearl Harbor attacked. The Pacific Fleet burning. War. Within hours, Japanese bombers appeared over Manila. Pappy Gunn watched from Nielsen Field as smoke rose from Clark Airfield 40 miles north. By afternoon, the Philippine Army Air Corps had been decimated, nearly every P-40 fighter destroyed on the ground. The mighty fortress America promised would defend the Philippines gone before lunch. But Gunn didn't panic. He calculated. Philippine Airlines officially ceased civilian operations on December 8. But Gunn saw opportunity in chaos. He had 12 functional Beechcraft 18s, twin-engine transports designed for passengers and cargo. They weren't fighters. They weren't bombers. But they could fly, and in a theater suddenly stripped of aircraft, anything that flew had value. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters, retreating toward Bataan Peninsula, desperately needed supply runs. Wounded soldiers needed evacuation. Intelligence officers needed transport between collapsing defensive positions. And Pappy Gunn had planes. For 6 weeks from December 1941 through January 1942, Gunn became the most improbable combat pilot in the Pacific. Flying unarmed civilian transports through Japanese-controlled airspace, he ferried ammunition to Bataan, evacuated nurses from Corregidor, retrieved downed pilots from jungle clearings. He navigated by dead reckoning, landed on roads and beaches, took off under fire. On December 28th, Japanese Zeros strafed his Beechcraft over Manila Bay. 37 bullet holes, 1 dead passenger, and Gunn landed it safely anyway. His crews called him Pappy, because at 42, he was older than most pilots by a decade. But also because he treated every mission like a father protecting his family, meticulous, relentless, personally invested. Then came the choice that would haunt him. By January 20th, 1942, MacArthur's position was untenable. The evacuation order came essential military personnel only. Families would have to stay. Civilian dependents would be protected under international law as non-combatants. Clara Gunn stood in their Manila home packing what she could carry. 4 children watched their father in his oil-stained flight jacket face gray with exhaustion. He had 1 seat available on tomorrow's flight to Australia, 1 seat. "Take Paul Jr.," Clara said quietly. Their oldest son, 16, could fly, could fight, could escape. But Pappy shook his head. "They'll respect the Red Cross. They'll honor the Geneva Convention. I'll come back for you. 2 months, maybe 3. It was the only time in his life Paul Gunn believed in rules. He hugged Clara until his arms ached, kissed each child, promised them, swore to them he'd return before summer. On January 23, 1942, he flew his last mission out of Manila. As the Beechcraft gained altitude, he looked back at the city burning in the distance. Somewhere down there, 5 people he loved more than breathing were walking toward Santo Tomas internment camp, clutching suitcases, believing in the mercy of international law. He never forgave himself for leaving, and he would spend every hour afterward trying to return. Gunn arrived in Darwin, Australia, on January 29th. The town had been bombed twice already. The Australian north coast had become the last functional Allied base between Japan and the southern continent. Everything was shortages and chaos. No spare parts, no munitions, barely enough fuel. The Allied air forces in the theater, officially designated the 5th Air Force, consisted of whatever had survived the retreat-damaged B-17s, a handful of aging P-40's exhausted crews. And then there was Pappy Gunn, a civilian contractor with a toolkit, and a very specific grudge. He reported to Townsville, Queensland, in February 1942, and was immediately commissioned as a captain in the United States Army Air Forces, not because of his flying record, but because someone noticed his real talent. He could fix anything. Brigadier General George C. Kenney, newly appointed commander of Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, saw Gunn's personnel file and said 6 words that changed history. Put him in charge of maintenance. But Gunn wasn't interested in maintenance. He was interested in rage. Every night he wrote letters. None reached Manila. Every morning he checked intelligence reports. Santo Tomas internment camp. 800 civilians imprisoned. Rations cut to 500 calories daily. No medical supplies, no word on individual prisoners. He stopped sleeping normally. Mechanics found him in hangars at 3 a.m., disassembling machine guns, measuring bolt patterns, sketching modifications in notebooks. When asked what he was working on, he'd mutter, "Making something that kills faster." The problem was tactical and obvious Allied bombers in the Pacific theater, B-17s, B-25s. Even the Australian Beauforts were designed for high-altitude strategic bombing. They dropped explosives from 20,000 feet and hoped gravity did the work. But in the jungles of New Guinea, where Japanese convoys moved at night under tree cover, high-altitude bombing was useless. You couldn't see the target, you couldn't hit it, and by the time you circled back, the enemy had vanished. What the Allies needed wasn't bigger bombs. They needed something that could fly low fast and turn ships into scrap metal in a single pass. They needed guns. Lots of guns, pointed forward. In March 1942, Gunn approached Kenney with a proposal so insane it almost got him court-martialed. Strip the transparent nose off an A-20 Havoc attack bomber, seal it with metal plating, and mount 4 forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns. Kenney stared at him. "The engineers said it can't be done. The recoil alone would..." The engineers Gunn interrupted aren't trying to get their families back. Kenny approved it, not because he believed it would work, but because desperation makes visionaries of angry men. For 6 months, Gunn worked in a corrugated metal hangar at Charters Towers Airfield, 130 kilometers inland from Townsville. He had no blueprints, no official approval from Douglas Aircraft, no support from Wright Field's engineering teams back in Ohio. What he had was a welding torch, scavenged parts from wrecked P-39 Cobras, and a willingness to ignore every safety regulation ever written. He reinforced the A-20's nose structure with steel salvaged from destroyed vehicles. He repositioned ammunition feeds to balance the aircraft's center of gravity. He test-fired guns on the ground until the airframe cracked, then welded it stronger. He rebuilt the electrical system 3 times, and when other mechanics said it was impossible, he'd ask them a simple question. "You got family in Manila?" No one argued after that. By September 1942, the modification was complete. 4 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, synchronized belt-fed, aimed dead ahead. Combined rate of fire, 2,000 rounds per minute. Effective range, 1,000 yards. And on September 12, 1942, with General Kenny watching from the control tower, Pappy Gunn climbed into the cockpit for the first combat test. The target, Buna Airfield, Papua New Guinea. Japanese staging ground for attacks on Port Moresby, defended by anti-aircraft batteries and Zero fighters. Gunn's orders were simple: fly low, fire everything, and prove the concept, or die trying. As the A-20's engines roared to life, a young mechanic asked him, "What if it doesn't work, Captain?" Gunn adjusted his headset eyes, cold. "Then my family dies knowing I tried." He shoved the throttles forward. The monster he'd built clawed into the sky. And 1,700 miles north in Santo Tomas Camp, Clara Gunn felt the monsoon rain on her face and whispered to her children, "Your father's coming. He promised." She had no idea how right she was, or what he was becoming to keep that promise. The A-20 Havoc crossed the coastline at Buna at 11:47 a.m. Altitude 60 feet. Airspeed 310 mph. Pappy Gunn's thumb hovered over the firing button. Through the armored glass, his own modification salvaged from a destroyed B-17 turret, he could see Japanese soldiers running toward anti-aircraft positions. He didn't hesitate. The trigger depressed. 4 machine guns erupted. What happened next rewrote doctrine. The 50 caliber rounds hit the parked aircraft. First 3 Mitsubishi Ki-21 bombers disintegrated in sequence, fuel tanks rupturing, wings shearing off. Then the ammunition dump. Then the barracks. Gunn held the trigger for exactly 4 seconds, 200 rounds downrange. When he pulled up at the runway's end, 12 separate fires burned below. In the right seat, his co-pilot, Lieutenant Robert "Smitty" Smith, 23 years old, from Omaha, was screaming, not in fear, in exhilaration. "Jesus Christ, Pappy! You see?" "I saw." Gunn's voice was flat. He banked hard left, checking fuel. "How many seconds before the Zeros scramble?" "We got maybe 2 minutes before, then we make another pass." Smith's face went white. "Sir, with respect, that's suicide. We emptied half the ammo boxes, the element of surprise is gone, and my wife is in Manila." Gunn shoved the stick forward. The A-20 dropped like a thrown hammer. "So we're making another pass." They did. This time, the anti-aircraft crews were ready. Tracers arced up. Gunn flew through them, teeth-clenched, firing until the barrels glowed. A fuel truck exploded. A radar station collapsed. And then they were over the ocean engines, screaming adrenaline masking the hydraulic fluid leaking from a punctured line. They landed at Port Moresby at 12:31 p.m., 14 new holes in the fuselage. Smith's hands shook so badly he couldn't unbuckle his harness. Gunn climbed out, walked to the nose, ran his fingers over the gun mounts. No cracks, no stress fractures. The welds had held. A ground crew sergeant approached. "Sir General Kenny's on the radio. Wants your after-action report." Gunn didn't look up. "Tell him it works. Tell him I need 50 more." Within a week, Kenny promoted him to major and gave him a new order due to the B-25 Mitchell what you did to the A-20. But bigger. The problem was scale. The A-20 was a light attack bomber, nimble, forgiving. The B-25 was a medium bomber, heavier, more complex, with a transparent bombardier's nose designed for precision high-altitude work. Converting it meant fundamentally changing its identity. It meant turning an instrument of strategic warfare into a street brawler. It meant doing to aviation engineering what Gunn had done to himself, stripping away the parts that felt human and replacing them with rage. He set up his workshop in Townsville in October 1942, requisitioning a warehouse near the airfield. No official budget. No approval from North American Aviation, the B-25's manufacturer. Just a handshake from Kenny and a blank check to steal whatever he needed. His crew grew to 15 mechanics. Australians, Americans, one New Zealander who could weld aluminum like it was clay. They called themselves Gunn's Goons, and they worked around the clock. 18-hour shifts, meals eaten standing up, sleep on cots between aircraft. The first B-25 they modified took 6 weeks. Gunn started by removing the entire transparent nose, the bombardier's station, the Norden bomb sight, the forward gun mount. Then he fabricated a solid metal nose cone reinforced with internal bracing. Into this he installed 8 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. 4 in the nose itself, paired left and right. 4 more in cheek blisters flanking the cockpit. Each gun belt, fed from ammunition boxes, relocated throughout the forward fuselage. But the real innovation was the synchronization. Gunn wired all 8 guns to fire simultaneously, converging their fire pattern at 400 yards. The electrical system had to be rebuilt. The airframe had to be rebalanced. 8 guns, plus ammunition, meant 200 pounds of forward weight. He compensated by repositioning radio equipment aft, removing the ventral turret, even stripping paint from non-essential surfaces. His crew thought he was chasing perfection. They were wrong. He was chasing speed. Every day he didn't finish was another day Clara and the children starved in Santo Tomas. In November, intelligence reports filtered south. Santo Tomas internment camp, population 3,800. Daily ration 900 calories down from 1,500. Red Cross parcels intercepted by Japanese guards. Dysentery spreading. A 6-year-old girl died of malnutrition. Her name was withheld to maintain morale. Gunn read the report in his warehouse office at 2 a.m. Then he walked onto the floor, picked up a welding torch, and worked until sunrise without speaking. His crew learned not to interrupt him on those nights. The welds he made in silence were always flawless. By December 1942, the first B-25 strafer was complete. But Gunn wasn't satisfied with 8 guns. He wanted more. He needed more. 10 guns. He told his lead engineer, Master Sergeant Jack Fox, a 34-year-old from Detroit, who'd built hot rods before the war. Fox stared at the blueprints. "Boss, the airframe can't take 10. The recoil alone. Then we reinforce the airframe. With what we're out of structural steel. Quartermaster says next shipment is 3 months out." Gunn walked to the corner of the warehouse where they stored salvage. He pointed at a wrecked P-40 Warhawk tail section sheared off. "That. Strip it. Use the longerons." "That's a fighter's internal structure. It's not rated for..." "It's rated to keep a pilot alive at 400 mph while being shot at. That's rated enough." Fox hesitated. Then he grinned. "You know what? Screw the manual. Let's build a monster." They did. By January 1943, the second B-25 carried 10 forward-firing guns. Then 12. By February, Gunn had perfected the configuration 14 50 caliber machine guns. 8 in the nose, 4 in cheek blisters, 2 in blisters further back on the fuselage. Combined rate of fire, 11,900 rounds per minute. The bombardier's position, once occupied by a 19-year-old kid with a Norden sight calculating trajectories, was now an ammunition bunker feeding belts to 4 chattering guns. The navigator's station was half filled with spare barrels. The entire aircraft had been reconceived around a single purpose point: hit at something and destroy it utterly. Kenny visited the warehouse in late February. He walked around the modified B-25 speechless. Finally, "How much does it cost to convert one?" Gunn shrugged. "About 6,000 man-hours, maybe 8,000 in parts if we're scrounging. And if we do this officially through proper channels, 3 times that, and 6 months longer." Kenny nodded slowly. "Then we do it your way. How many can you build by March?" "How many you need?" "Enough to sink every Japanese ship between here and Manila." Gunn's jaw tightened. "Then I'll build them all." But building them wasn't the same as proving they worked. In early March, Kenny received intelligence that changed everything. A massive Japanese convoy was heading for Lae, New Guinea. 8 transports carrying 600 and 900 troops, 4 destroyer escorts. It was the largest reinforcement operation since Guadalcanal, and it was Gunn's chance. On March 2, 1943, at 9:15 a.m., 13 B-25 strafers took off from Port Moresby. Gunn flew the lead aircraft. Behind him, crews he'd trained personally, men who'd watched him weld guns at 3 a.m., who'd heard him mutter his children's names in his sleep. The flight to the Bismarck Sea took 90 minutes. They flew low under radar-skimming waves. At 10:45 a.m., Gunn spotted the convoy, 8 fat transport ships in a neat line, destroyers on the flanks perfectly exposed. Over the radio, "This is Lead. Attack pattern Alpha. Go low, go fast, and don't stop shooting until you're over the horizon." His co-pilot, now Captain Smith, promoted after Boona, glanced over. "You think they'll surrender?" Gunn pushed the throttles to max power. "I don't care." The B-25s hit the convoy in a staggered line, each aircraft offset by 10 seconds. Gunn's plane reached the first transport at 11:02 a.m. He opened fire at 800 yards. 14 machine guns firing simultaneously sound like the world tearing apart. The transport's bridge exploded. Superstructure collapsed. Lifeboats shredded. The ship didn't sink gracefully, it came apart. Hull rupturing steam, venting, men jumping into water that was already boiling from ruptured fuel tanks. Gunn flew through the debris, pulled up, circled, attacked again. By the time the sun set on March 3rd, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was over. 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers obliterated, an estimated 3,000 Japanese soldiers drowned. Allied losses: 4 aircraft, 13 men. It was the most lopsided naval engagement in the Pacific War. And it had been won by a 43-year-old mechanic who couldn't get his family out of his head. Kenny called it the most economical use of air power in history. War correspondents called it a miracle. Pilots called it the day Pappy Gunn made the ocean red. But Gunn didn't celebrate. When he landed at Port Moresby covered in gun smoke, hands blistered from gripping the controls, a reporter asked him how he felt. He looked north toward Manila and said, "Ask me when I get my family back." That night he wrote another letter. It never reached Clara. But he wrote it anyway because not writing felt like forgetting, and forgetting felt like betrayal. "Clara, I'm building you a road home. It's made of steel and fire. I'm sorry it's taking so long. I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry for everything except loving you. Wait for me. I'm coming." He sealed it, put it in the box with the others, and went back to the warehouse. 3 more B-25s needed guns. Sleep could wait. Sleep was for men whose families were safe. By April 1943, Gunn's strafers were operational across the 5th Air Force. Every squadron wanted them. North American Aviation, upon learning what he'd done to their aircraft, sent engineers to study his modifications. They arrived with clipboards and regulations. They left with notebooks full of ideas and a profound respect for improvisation born from desperation. One engineer, a 28-year-old from Wichita named Harold Benson, asked Gunn the question everyone wondered: how did you know it would work? The calculations alone should have taken months. Gunn was torquing a gun mount. He didn't look up. "I didn't know. I just knew what happens if I do nothing." Benson nodded slowly. "Your family, in Manila." 4 kids, wife. They've been in Santo Tomas for 16 months. 16 months of rice and dysentery and guards who think international law is a suggestion. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just tell your bosses to build these faster." They did. By July 1943, North American Aviation began factory producing B-25G and B-25H models with forward guns as standard, not 14, like Gunn's field modifications, but enough to prove the concept. The official designation was strafer configuration, but everyone knew the real name, Pappy's Monsters. Yet even as his creation spread across the Pacific, Gunn stayed in Australia welding guns, flying missions, bleeding from wounds he didn't mention in reports. He was shot down twice more, crash-landed 4 times. Accumulated shrapnel in his back, burns on his forearms, a cracked rib that never quite healed. His crew begged him to rest. Kenny ordered him to take leave. He ignored them all. "I'll rest," he said, "when I hear my daughter's voice." And in Santo Tomas, 1,700 miles away, 10-year-old Connie Gunn whispered to her mother in the dark, "Is Daddy still alive?" Clara held her close, feeling her daughter's ribs through skin, and lied with a mother's certainty. "He's alive, and he's coming." She didn't know about the guns, the ships, the fire. She didn't know her husband had become something the war had never seen, a man who'd weaponized grief into doctrine. But she knew this Paul Gunn kept promises, even when keeping them required transforming himself into a monster. Even when the cost was counted in steel sleepless nights and a rage that never ever cooled. The promotion to lieutenant colonel came in August 1943, delivered by courier to the Townsville warehouse, while Gunn was elbow-deep in a gun mount assembly. He read the orders, folded them into his pocket, and went back to work. Rank meant nothing. Every minute spent celebrating was a minute Clara went hungry. But Kenny had other plans. On August 19th, he arrived unannounced, walked past the mechanics, and found Gunn test-firing a modified nose assembly on a wooden frame outside the hangar. "You're flying to Brisbane tomorrow," Kenny said without preamble. "There's a war bond rally. They want the hero who invented the strafer to..." "No." Kenny's jaw tightened. "That wasn't a request, Colonel." Gunn set down the wrench, turned. His eyes were hollow, ringed with sleeplessness. "General, with respect, I don't do parades. I do guns. And right now I've got 4 B-25s that need modifications by Friday, or they're worthless in the Rabaul offensive." "The Rabaul offensive is covered. You've already built 60 strafers. The job's done." "The job's done when I get my family back." Kenny stepped closer, lowered his voice. "Pappy, listen to me. You've flown 83 combat missions in 18 months. You've been shot down 3 times. Your medical file says you've got shrapnel in 4 places, second-degree burns that never healed properly, and you're running on 4 hours of sleep a week. You're no good to anyone dead." Gunn picked up the wrench again. "Then I better work fast." Kenny stared at him. Then quietly, "What if they're already dead?" The wrench stopped mid-turn. Gunn's knuckles went white around the handle. For 5 seconds, the only sound was the distant hum of aircraft engines. Then, "They're not." "How do you know?" "Because if they were, I'd feel it. And I don't feel it. I feel them waiting. So I keep building." Kenny recognized the look. He'd seen it before in men who'd lost something irreplaceable and filled the void with purpose. It was the look that won wars. It was also the look that destroyed men from the inside. "All right," Kenny said. "No bond rally. But you're taking 3 days off. Doctor's orders. And mine." Gunn nodded, said nothing, and the moment Kenny left, went back to work. He didn't take 3 days off. He didn't take 3 hours. Because 700 miles north in Manila time was running out. Santo Tomas internment camp in August 1943 was a study in slow death. The Japanese had cut rations again, 700 calories daily, mostly rice weevils and watery lugao. Dysentery was epidemic. Beriberi common. Children who'd arrived in January 1942 at healthy weights now had legs like sticks and bellies distended from malnutrition. Clara Gunn, now 41, but looking 60, spent her days in the camp kitchen stretching meals, bartering cigarettes for vegetable scraps, teaching other mothers how to make acorn flour edible. Her 4 children were still alive, but barely. Paul Jr., now 18, worked in the camp's electrical shop fixing wiring for Japanese guards in exchange for extra food. Julie, 16, taught younger children to read using pages torn from old magazines. Nathaniel, 12, had contracted dengue fever in July and nearly died. Connie, 10, no longer played. She sat quietly conserving energy, her eyes older than they should be. Clara never spoke about Pappy, not because she'd given up hope, but because hope cost calories and she couldn't afford to waste them on tears. But late at night, lying on her wooden bunk listening to the sounds of 800 people trying to sleep in a space built for 400, she'd whisper calculations. It had been 20 months since he left. 20 months of silence. No letters made it through. No Red Cross notifications. For all she knew, he'd died in the retreat from Bataan, crashed into the Coral Sea, been captured and executed. Yet something kept her certain. Call it faith. Call it stubbornness. Call it the memory of how he'd looked at her that last day, the way a drowning man looks at shore. "He's building something," she whispered to the darkness. "I don't know what, but he's building it for us." She was more right than she knew. By October 1943, Gunn's strafers had sunk 42 Japanese ships, destroyed 160 aircraft on the ground, and turned the tide in New Guinea. MacArthur's forces were advancing. The Philippines were back on the strategic map. But back on the map didn't mean liberation. It meant months, maybe a year. Gunn started taking risks. Volunteers for missions that had a 30% survival rate. Flying with injuries that should have grounded him. On November 8th, during a raid on Wewak Airfield, his B-25 took a 20mm cannon round through the cockpit. The co-pilot, Lieutenant James Warren, 24, from Sacramento, was killed instantly. Gunn, bleeding from a head wound, flew the aircraft back 220 miles, landed it one-handed, then walked to the infirmary and stitched himself up. The flight surgeon tried to ground him for a week. Gunn was back in the cockpit the next morning. "You have a death wish," the surgeon said. "No, I have a wife and 4 children. Those aren't the same thing." But the crew noticed changes. He stopped eating regularly, lost 20 pounds. Developed a tremor in his left hand. And he talked to himself, not ranting, but conversational, as if Clara and the kids were right there in the cockpit. "Connie, you'd love this view. See how the sun hits the water. That's called a sun dog. I'll teach you the physics when I get home." His navigator. Captain Roy Howell, 29, from Montana, heard these one-sided conversations and said nothing. Because they all had ghosts. They all talked to someone who wasn't there. War did that. Grief did that. The difference was, Gunn's ghosts were still alive, and that made his madness purposeful. In December 1943, intelligence reported that conditions in Santo Tomas were deteriorating rapidly. The Japanese commandant, a career officer named Lieutenant Colonel Toshio Hayashi, had begun confiscating Red Cross parcels outright. Medical supplies were non-existent. Deaths were occurring at a rate of 3 per week. Malnutrition disease despair. Gunn read the report in his office alone at 1 a.m. He read it 3 times. Then he walked onto the warehouse floor, selected a B-25 that was scheduled for routine maintenance, and spent the next 8 hours modifying it in ways that weren't in any manual. He added 2 additional gun blisters. Increased the ammunition load by 40%, stripping out everything non-essential radio equipment, extra oxygen tanks, even the co-pilot's seat. The aircraft became a flying gun platform, unstable, unbalanced, and utterly lethal. His crew chief, Master Sergeant Fox, found him at dawn covered in grease eyes red. "Boss, what the hell is this? Insurance." For what? Gunn straightened, joints popping. For when they tell me I can't fly to Manila and get my family myself. For when someone has to go in there and make the Japanese sorry they ever heard the name Gunn. Fox looked at the aircraft, then at Gunn. You know that's suicide, right? Even if you made it to Manila, which you won't, not solo, not with half the Imperial Navy between here and there. Even if you did, you'd be shot down before you cross the city limits. I know. And you're building it anyway. I'm building it anyway. Fox was quiet for a long moment. Then, you need a co-pilot for that thing. Gunn shook his head. I need you here building more, in case I don't make it back. Wow. You really think someone's gonna let you do this? I think, Gunn said slowly, that if liberation takes longer than 6 months, I'm not asking permission. He never flew that aircraft. Because in January 1944, MacArthur announced the plan, Operation Cartwheel would retake the Philippines by late 1944 or early 1945. The timetable was set. Liberation was coming. But coming still meant Clara and the children had to survive until then. In Santo Tomas, January 1944 brought a new horror. The Japanese began segregating able-bodied men into separate barracks, preparing for potential forced labor. Paul Jr., now 19, was taken. Clara fought the guards, screaming, clawing, until they struck her unconscious with a rifle butt. When she woke, her eldest son was gone. She never saw him again in the camp. He'd been transferred to a labor detail building fortifications north of Manila. She didn't know if he was alive. She didn't know if he was fed. She only knew that her family, already fractured by Pappy's absence, had fractured further. That night, for the first time since the war began, Clara Gunn cried. Not quietly, not with dignity. She sobbed into a rag body, shaking, until Julie held her and whispered, "Daddy's coming. You said so. Daddy's coming." And Clara, choking on grief and hope, whispered back, "He better hurry." 1,700 miles south. Pappy Gunn woke from a nightmare, Clara's voice calling his name fading into static, and immediately went to work. No coffee, no breakfast, just work. He was welding a gun mount when Kenny found him at 6 a.m. "Pappy, we got new intel. Santo Tomas is stable. Death rate's down. Your family's listed as alive on the Red Cross registry." Gunn's hands stopped shaking. All 4, wife and 3 children. Paul Jr.'s listed separately. Labor detail, but alive. Where? North of Manila. Construction battalion. That's all we have. Gunn nodded slowly, jaw working. When do we invade? Officially October at the earliest. Maybe January 45. That's a year from now. I know. They won't last a year. Kenny met his eyes. Then we better make sure it's not a year. And the way we do that is, you keep building these strafers. Every ship we sink, every convoy we destroy, we get closer. You understand? You're already bringing them home. Every gun you mount is a day closer. It was the kindest lie Kenny ever told, and Gunn, because he needed to believe it, did. So he built. Through February, March, April, modified 80 more strafers, trained crews, flew missions when he wasn't supposed to, got shot down again in May, his 4th crash, walked away with a broken finger and burned uniform. Refused evacuation, flew the next day. His body was failing, his mind was fraying, but his hands stayed steady. Because hands that built guns didn't have time to tremble. In June 1944, the Allies invaded Normandy. The European war turned, attention shifted. Resources flowed west, and in the Pacific, MacArthur's offensive slowed. The new liberation date, January 1945. Gunn heard the news and said nothing. Just went back to the warehouse, picked up his torch, and welded through the night. Fox found him at 3 a.m., slumped against a workbench, asleep on his feet. "Boss, you gotta rest." Gunn's eyes opened. "Can't. She's waiting. She'll wait another day. No. His voice cracked. She's waited 900 days. 600 hours. I counted. Every single one. And I can't give her any of them back. But I can make sure there's not 22,000. Fox didn't argue. Just handed him coffee and picked up a wrench. They worked until dawn. Two men building guns for a war that had already taken everything but hope. And in Manila, in a camp where 800 people slowly starved behind barbed wire, Clara Gunn taught her daughters to divide 1 cup of rice into 3 meals, to boil water twice for safety, to sleep on their sides to ease the hunger cramps. She taught them mathematics of survival, how many calories to live, how many to die. She taught them to steal soap trade buttons, hide food. She taught them everything except how to stop believing their father was coming. Because some lies are too necessary to abandon. Some hopes are load-bearing. And in a place built to erase humanity, the Gunn family's certainty that Pappy was out there building something, fighting something, becoming something, that certainty was the only thing keeping them alive. Even if that something was a monster made of guns and grief and a blacksmith's son's refusal to accept that some things can't be fixed with a wrench and enough rage. July 1944. Gunn stopped counting days. The numbers had become unbearable. 1,000 days, 100, each one a accusation. Instead, he counted guns. 18 more strafers modified. 23. 30. As long as his hands moved, his mind couldn't calculate how much weight his daughters had lost, how many calories separated Clara from collapse. On July 18th, Kenny called him into headquarters in Brisbane. MacArthur was there standing over maps of the Philippines, his corncob pipe clenched between teeth. He looked up when Gunn entered. "Colonel Gunn, I understand your family is in Santo Tomas." "Yes, sir." "And you've been building strafers for 2 years to help us get there faster." "That's one way to put it, sir." MacArthur studied him, the gaunt face, the burn scars on his forearms, the tremor Gunn couldn't quite hide anymore. "I'm moving the invasion up. October 20th late. We'll be in Manila by January, maybe February." Gunn's throat tightened. "February's 7 months, sir. It's also 4 months faster than the original plan. And it's happening because of those guns you've been welding at 3 a.m. when you think no one's watching." MacArthur stepped closer. "I need you to keep building them. And I need you alive to see your family when we liberate that camp. Can you do that?" It wasn't a request. It was a general telling a man not to die before his war ended. "Yes, sir." "Good. Because I'm making you a promise, Colonel. When we hit Manila, you're going in with the first wave. You're going to walk into that camp yourself. That's an order." Gunn saluted, turned to leave, then stopped. "Sir, what if they're not there? What if the Japanese evacuate the camp before we arrive?" MacArthur's face hardened. "Then we hunt them down. Every last one." It should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Because 7 months was an eternity when you were starving. In Santo Tomas, July brought typhoons and new cruelty. The Japanese, sensing the war turning, became erratic. Random beatings, sudden confiscations. On July 22nd, Lieutenant Colonel Hayashi ordered all internees to bow when Japanese soldiers passed. Those who didn't were struck with rifle butts. Clara bowed. So did Julie and Nathaniel and Connie. They bowed because pride was a luxury they couldn't afford. But Clara taught her children to bow with their backs, straight eyes forward. "You can bend," she whispered, "but you don't break." Connie, now 11, asked the question that haunted them all. "Mama, is Daddy even alive?" Clara lied with the conviction of someone who'd been lying to herself for 100 days. "He's alive, and he's fighting, every single day." She had no evidence, no letters, no proof. Just the stubborn arithmetic of faith. If Pappy Gunn had died, the universe would have felt different, colder, and it didn't. So he must be alive. She was right, but only barely. In September 1944, Gunn collapsed during a mission, flew a strafer to Balikpapan, Borneo, destroyed an oil refinery, and on the return leg, blacked out at the controls. His co-pilot, Captain Eddie Brock, 27 from Texas, grabbed the stick and landed the aircraft while Gunn convulsed in the seat, burning with fever. The diagnosis: malaria, malnutrition, exhaustion. The prescribed treatment: 6 weeks bed rest, IV fluids, anti-malarials. Gunn was back at work in 4 days. "You're going to kill yourself," the flight surgeon said. "No," Gunn replied, hands shaking as he tightened a bolt. "I'm going to kill enough of them that my family gets to live." The logic was airtight. The logic was insane. But no one could stop him, because stopping him meant admitting that some griefs were too large to survive, and if they admitted that, they'd have to look at their own losses. So they let him work. Let him fly. Let him burn himself down to ash and fury. October 20th, 1944. MacArthur landed at Leyte. The liberation of the Philippines began. Gunn, grounded by direct order from Kenny, listened to the radio reports and counted 300 miles to Manila. Maybe 90 days. Maybe 100. He started modifying strafers with extra fuel tanks for the Manila assault. Kenny found him in the warehouse at midnight. "Pappy, you're not cleared to fly. You're barely cleared to stand." "I'm cleared to keep my promise." "You can't keep it if you're dead." Gunn looked up, eyes hollow. "General, I've been dead since January 42. I'm just waiting for my body to figure it out." Kenny had no answer for that. So he did the only thing he could. He gave Gunn a desk job coordinating strafer deployments, hoping paperwork would keep him from killing himself. It didn't work. Gunn processed deployment orders during the day and modified aircraft at night. Slept 3 hours. Ate when forced. And every morning he checked casualty reports from Santo Tomas. November 12 deaths. December 18. Starvation accelerating. Medical supplies exhausted. The Japanese, now facing certain defeat, stopped pretending to care. On January 9, 1945, MacArthur's forces landed at Lingayen Gulf, 120 miles north of Manila. The city was within reach. But between the beaches and Santo Tomas stood 40,000 Japanese defenders, orders to fight to the death, and a commandant who'd received instructions that chilled intelligence analysts. If evacuation becomes necessary, internees are to be eliminated to prevent their rescue. Gunn read the intercepted order on January 15th. Read it twice. Then walked outside and vomited behind the headquarters building. Captain Howell found him there shaking. "Boss, they're going to kill them. If we're too slow, if we hit the wrong sector first, if we spook them, they're going to execute 800 civilians and burn the evidence. We won't let that happen." How do we stop it? We're still 60 miles out. We're moving at 5 miles a day. That's 12 more days. How does Clara survive 12 more days? Howell had no answer, because there wasn't one. Liberation had always been a race between MacArthur's army and Japanese cruelty, and the race was too close to call. But on February 1st, something unexpected happened. A tank battalion, the 44th Tank Battalion 1st Cavalry Division, broke through Japanese lines south of Manila. Their commander, Brigadier General William Chase, received intelligence that Santo Tomas might be massacred within 48 hours. He made a decision that violated every tactical doctrine. He ordered a flying column, 8 tanks, 100 men, to punch through 8 miles of enemy territory and reach the camp before the order came down. They moved at night, full speed, no artillery support, just tanks and desperation. At 8:30 p.m. on February 3, 1945, those tanks crashed through the gates of Santo Tomas internment camp. Clara Gunn heard the explosions first, then shouting in English, then a sound she'd forgotten existed. American accents, loud and profane and beautiful. She grabbed Julie and Nathaniel and Connie and ran toward the gates, barefoot ribs showing through her dress. Around her, 800 skeletons in rags, began to scream not in fear, but in joy so violent it sounded like agony. A young sergeant, maybe 20, climbed off a tank and stared at the crowd. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "What did they do to you?" Clara pushed forward. "Do you have a list? Is there a list of who's coming? Is Paul Gunn?" "Ma'am, we just got here. We don't have—" "He's a pilot, Lieutenant Colonel. He promised he'd come. Is he?" The sergeant saw her face and lied with the kindness soldiers learn in war. "Ma'am, if he promised he's coming—" Clara nodded, tears cutting through grime. "Then we'll wait." For 2 more days, the camp remained a battleground. Japanese soldiers barricaded in the education building refused to surrender. Firefights erupted. 6 internees died in the crossfire, but the Americans held, and reinforcements arrived. On February 5th, at 10:15 a.m., a convoy of trucks rolled through the gates, medic supplies, reporters, and one man who jumped off the running board before the vehicle stopped moving. Pappy Gunn. He'd flown to Leyte the moment he heard the camp was liberated, caught a transport to Manila, and talked his way onto the first convoy heading to Santo Tomas. He was wearing a flight suit still smelled like gun oil, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He stood at the gate scanning thousands of faces, every one of them gaunt, hollow-eyed, barely human. Then he saw her. Clara was standing near the main building, holding Connie's hand. She looked 70. She weighed maybe 90 pounds. Her hair had gone gray. But when she saw him, she smiled. And it was the smile he'd been building guns to see for 134 days. He ran. Clara ran. They collided in the center of the courtyard, holding each other like drowning people clutching driftwood. Pappy tried to speak. Couldn't. Just held her, feeling her bones, her heartbeat the proof that she was real. Clara whispered into his shoulder. "You came." "I promised." "I know. I knew." Julie and Nathaniel and Connie surrounded them crying, and Pappy sank to his knees, pulling them all close. He counted them 3, not 4, and looked up at Clara. "Paul Jr. Labor camp, north of the city. We don't know where." Pappy's jaw set. "I'll find him." And he did. Spent 3 weeks tracking down labor camp rosters, flying reconnaissance over suspected sites, until he found his son alive, sick with dysentery, 30 pounds underweight, but alive in a camp near San Fernando. When Paul Jr. saw his father walk into that camp, he said one word, "Dad." And Pappy, who'd built monsters to get here, who'd welded guns at 3 a.m., and flown missions with malaria, and crashed 4 times and refused to die. Until this moment, Pappy Gunn, the man who fought the war with wrenches, finally broke down and cried. They went home together, all 6 of them, flew to Australia on February 28th. Clara weighed 87 pounds. The children couldn't digest solid food yet. Paul Jr. needed surgery for intestinal damage. But they were alive, and that Pappy decided was the only victory that mattered. Kenny visited them in the hospital in Brisbane. Found Pappy sitting beside Clara's bed holding her hand while she slept. "You did it," Kenny said quietly. Pappy shook his head. "I didn't save them. They saved themselves. I just made sure nobody stopped them. You built 200 strafers, sank 60 ships, killed thousands of enemy soldiers. That's not nothing." "No, but it's not them either." He looked at Clara, at the IV in her arm, the hollows in her cheeks. "I should have been faster." "Pappy, if you'd been any faster, you'd be dead." "Maybe, but they wouldn't have starved for 100 days." Kenny had no response, because guilt doesn't listen to logic. And some wounds don't heal just because the war ends. But this much was true. Paul Gunn had made a promise on January 23, 1942, when he flew away from Manila. And on February 5, 1945, he kept it. The cost was measured in sleepless nights, in scars from welding and malaria and shrapnel, and 4 crashes. The cost was counted in guns, 200 aircraft modified, 2 800 machine guns installed, 11 million rounds fired. But when Clara Gunn woke in that hospital bed and saw Pappy sleeping in the chair beside her, hand still holding hers, she didn't think about costs. She thought, he came back. Just like he said. And for a man who'd spent 3 years turning himself into a weapon that was the only absolution that mattered. The war ended on August 15, 1945. Pappy Gunn was in Brisbane when he heard the news, sitting beside Clara's hospital bed while she ate her first full meal in 3 years, chicken soup bread with butter and apple that made her cry because she'd forgotten fruit could taste sweet. He didn't celebrate, didn't drink, didn't feel relief. He felt something stranger, the sudden absence of purpose. For 326 days, he'd had a singular mission: build gun-sink ships, get his family back. Now the mission was complete, and he didn't know what to do with hands that had spent 3 years welding steel and rage together. Clara saw it in his face, reached across and took his hand. "You're allowed to rest now." "I don't know how." "Then I'll teach you. The same way you taught me to wait." But rest didn't come easy. The Army offered him full retirement, a pension commendations. He refused them all. "I didn't do it for medals," he told Kenny. "I did it because they were mine." In September, the family moved back to Manila. The city was rubble, 80% destroyed in the battle for liberation, 100,000 civilians dead, infrastructure shattered. Santo Tomas stood empty, windows blown out, walls pocked with bullet holes. Clara refused to go near it. "I spent 100 days in that place," she said. "I'm not spending another minute." But Pappy went. Walked through the courtyard where he'd found her, stood in the barracks where his children had slept on wooden boards, touched the walls that had held them. A Filipino groundskeeper found him there, standing motionless. "You were here?" the man asked in English. "My family was. I wasn't. That's the problem." The groundskeeper nodded slowly. "You are the pilot, the one who made the guns." "How'd you know?" "Everyone knows. The Japanese, before they fled, they spoke of you, called you the devil who puts guns on bombers. They were afraid of you." Gunn looked at his hands, scarred, trembling, useless now that there was nothing left to build. "I wasn't trying to scare them. I was trying to kill them fast enough to get here." "You did. You came. Your family lived. That is not nothing." But it felt like nothing. Because 800 people had been liberated from Santo Tomas, but 500 had died before the tanks arrived. Because his children had spent 3 years starving while he welded guns in Australia. Because Paul Jr. still woke up screaming from dreams of labor camps. Because Connie flinched when anyone raised their voice. Because Clara's hair had gone gray at 42 and would never turn brown again. Victory. Pappy learned doesn't erase cost. It just changes who pays it. Philippine Airlines wanted him back. The company had been destroyed during the occupation, but they were rebuilding, and they needed someone who understood aircraft, who knew Manila, who could navigate the chaos of post-war recovery. In November 1945, Pappy accepted the position of technical director, the same job he'd held in 1941, as if the war had been a terrible intermission. He rebuilt the airline the way he'd built strafers, obsessively personally, with an attention to detail that bordered on mania. Every aircraft inspected personally. Every maintenance procedure rewritten. Every safety protocol tested twice. His crew thought he was paranoid. Clara knew better. "You're making sure no one else loses what you almost lost," she told him one night. "Is that wrong?" "No. It's just exhausting, for you and everyone around you." He tried to ease up. Couldn't. Because every time he saw an aircraft with a mechanical flaw, he thought, what if that fails? What if someone's family is on board? What if they die because I didn't check twice? The war had taught him that negligence had consequences measured in lives, and he couldn't unlearn that. In 1948, the Air Force formally retired him with the rank of colonel. The ceremony was small. A handful of officers, a plaque, a handshake. Kenny gave the speech. "Paul Gunn," he said, "invented a weapon that changed naval warfare. He personally modified 200 aircraft, trained 500 crews, and flew 180 combat missions. His strafers sank 67 ships, destroyed 300 aircraft, and saved thousands of Allied lives. But that's not why we honor him today. He paused, looked at Pappy. We honor him because he fought an entire war for one reason, to keep a promise to his wife. And he kept it. That's the rarest kind of victory. The applause was polite. Pappy shook hands, accepted the plaque, went home. That night, he put it in a drawer and never looked at it again. Clara found him in the garage at midnight, sketching aircraft modifications in a notebook. She stood in the doorway, watching until he noticed her. I can't stop, he said quietly. I keep thinking, what if there's a better way? What if I missed something? What if someone needs... Paul, she crossed to him, took the pencil from his hand. The war is over. You won. We're alive. You're allowed to stop fighting. I don't know how to stop. I only know how to build. Then build something that isn't a weapon. Build a life. With me. With the kids. We're still here. We still need you. Just not the version of you that welds guns at 3 a.m. He looked at her gray hairlines around her eyes, hands that still trembled when loud noises startled her. She'd survived hell, and she was asking him to survive peace. I'll try, he said, and he did. For 9 years, Paul Gunn lived an almost normal life. He ran Philippine Airlines, watched his children grow. Paul Jr. became an engineer, Julie, a teacher, Nathaniel, a doctor, Connie, a pilot following her father's path. He and Clara bought a house in Manila with a garden, planted mango trees, hosted dinners, laughed sometimes. But the nightmares never stopped, and neither did the guilt. In 1953, a journalist tracked him down, wanted to write a book about the strafer program. Pappy refused. I didn't invent anything, he said. I just put guns where they weren't supposed to go because I was desperate. That's not genius. That's grief. But it worked. You changed how we fight wars. Maybe. But I didn't do it to change wars. I did it to end one. My war. And even that didn't work because my family still suffered. So what's there to write about a man who built weapons because he couldn't save the people he loved? That's not a story. That's just sad. The journalist left. But the story spread anyway. Air Force historians studied his modifications. Engineering schools taught his improvisations. The AC-47 Spooky, the AC-130 Spectre. Every gunship that came after bore his fingerprints. The principle he'd proven that transport aircraft could become weapons platforms became doctrine. But Pappy never claimed credit. When people called him a genius, he'd shake his head. A genius would have figured it out without losing 3 years. I was just a mechanic with a welding torch and a family in prison. Anyone would have done the same. They wouldn't have. But he believed it. Because accepting that he'd done something extraordinary meant accepting that Clara and the children had suffered for something meaningful. And he couldn't accept that. Their suffering wasn't meaningful. It was just suffering. On October 11th, 1957, Paul Gunn was flying a routine inspection flight over Luzon when his aircraft, a small Beechcraft, the same model he'd flown in 1941, suffered engine failure. He radioed his position, tried to restart, couldn't. The plane went down in the mountains north of Manila. Search teams found the wreckage 2 days later. He was 58 years old. Clara buried him in Manila in a cemetery overlooking the bay. The funeral was massive airline employees, former crew members, Filipino officials, American veterans. Kenny flew from the States to deliver the eulogy. Pappy Gunn, he said, voice breaking, was the most stubborn, brilliant, reckless, and decent man I ever commanded. He fought a war with a wrench because he didn't have time to wait for proper weapons. He saved thousands of lives by taking every risk himself. And he did it all for 5 people. That's not just heroism. That's love so fierce it bent the world. Paul Jr., now 33, stood beside his mother and siblings. After the service, a reporter asked him what his father had been like. Tired. Paul Jr. said. Always tired, like he was carrying something too heavy to put down. But he never complained, just kept working, kept building. Even after the war ended, he kept building like he was afraid that if he stopped, something terrible would happen. Did he ever talk about the war? Once. I asked him why he did it, why he risked everything, and he said, because the opposite of love isn't hate, it's distance, and I couldn't stand being distant from you. That was it. That was his whole reason. The reporter wrote it down. But he didn't understand it. Not really. Because understanding required knowing what it felt like to be 1 to 700 miles from everyone you love, holding a welding torch counting the days until you could stop counting. Clara lived until 1982. She never remarried. Every year on October 11th, she visited Pappy's grave, brought flowers, sat on the grass. Sometimes she talked to him. Mostly, she just sat. In 1980, an Air Force historian found her asked if she'd be willing to be interviewed about her husband's legacy. Legacy? Clara laughed, not bitterly. He didn't care about legacy. He cared about getting us back. That's all. Everything else, the guns, the ships, the doctrine, that was just what happened while he was trying to love us from 700 miles away. Do you think he succeeded? Clara thought for a long moment. He kept his promise. We lived, but I think part of him died in that warehouse in Australia, welding guns at 3 a.m., and he never got that part back. So yes, he succeeded. And no, he didn't. That's war. You win and lose at the same time. The interview was never published. Clara died 2 years later, 83 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Today, the B-25 strafer sits in museums in Dayton, in Canberra, in Manila. Docents explain the innovation forward-firing guns, synchronized fire low-altitude attack doctrine. They talk about the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. The ships sunk, the war shortened. But they rarely mention the man who built them. Or why? Because military history remembers tactics, not motives. It records what happened, not why it mattered. And Paul Gunn's story isn't about tactics. It's about a blacksmith's son from Arkansas who learned that love, when desperate enough, can be weaponized. That grief properly directed can sink ships. That a man willing to break every rule to keep a promise can change how wars are fought. His toolbox is in a museum in Manila now. Rusty wrenches, a welding torch, a notebook filled with sketches. Beside it, a placard reads, Colonel Paul Gunn, 1899 to 1957, inventor of the strafer doctrine, father, husband, and the man who fought World War II with a wrench. But the placard doesn't mention the most important part, that every gun he mounted, every bolt he tightened, every sleepless night he spent in that Australian warehouse, all of it was a prayer. Not for victory, not for glory, just for the sound of his daughter's voice, for the weight of his wife's hand in his, for the chance to be a father again instead of a weapon. He got that chance. For 12 years after liberation, he got to be Pappy again instead of Colonel Gunn. Got to plant mango trees and attend graduations and grow old beside Clara. It wasn't enough time. It's never enough time. But it was time he built hour by hour, gun by gun, in a corrugated metal hangar under the Australian sun, refusing to accept that some people are too far away to save. The war tried to take his family, and he said no, not with speeches or strategy, with a welding torch and the kind of stubbornness that only comes from loving someone more than you love rules. That's the legacy, not the guns, the refusal. If you believe that kind of love deserves remembering, if you believe that a mechanic's fury matters as much as a general's strategy, then share this story. Write a name in the comments. A grandfather who fought, a grandmother who waited, a family separated by war and reunited by someone's stubborn promise. Because Paul Gunn built weapons, but what he really built was a road home. And roads like that don't just save one family. They remind us all what we're fighting for when everything else falls apart. He welded guns because he loved his wife, and the world has never been the same.